Howdy, folks, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome to Volume 3 of my account of being a sorority security guard in the very late 90s in Austin. Now, in this volume, Volume 3, 3 whole hours into the story, I will actually work as a security guard. I guess, everybody loves a good backstory. Luckily, I've given you tons of that. I'm like the J.R.R. Tolkien of podcasters. Eventually, we'll need a concordance and, a glossary for all the special terms. It's kind of like a fantasy novel. I think that's the best way to think about it. So, in the previous 2 volumes, what did we get done? I threw some shade at some former roommates. I talked about how my first roommate shot me, kind of. A character in a play that he was playing used a cap gun to, quote-unquote, kill. I guess, could you call that killing in effigy? Anyway, he shot this guy on stage who was named Dr. Lecornu. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. I'm not good at hints or indirect communication like that. We also talked about Scientology, and I promise that will come back. It'll be relevant. Today we're going to start on the day that I interviewed with Ron. We're definitely going to meet Ron, but I do have a couple of apologies to make. My first apology will have to be about the lack of a rap song. I know. We were all waiting for Vincent to humiliate himself, but it'll have to wait one more week. It turns out that my recent illness put a bigger damper on the launch of my hip-hop career than I thought it would. And as you can probably hear from my voice, I'm still not 100%. More like 95%. But I tell you, boy, is it gonna be worth the wait. Maybe. So, this episode will make up for the lack of music with maybe better characters and more story. Something I maybe didn't cover in the last episodes. Basically, the last episode, Volume 2, was kind of like Christopher Nolan's movie Tenet. It had some really cool music, but I didn't like any of the characters, and I didn't understand what was happening. I mean, I think I got assaulted by followers of some cult in the back of a bookstore, and I still don't understand what that has to do with sororities. So this episode, I'll do better. This episode, Volume 3, will be a lot more like Batman Begins. So if you think about how Batman Begins, it's about a ripped, absolute unit of a man trying to find justice in a city full of violence and corruption. And so that's kind of like me in 1997. And speaking of 1997, my second apology will have to be about the years for somebody who was technically, theoretically, a history major. I'm playing fast and loose with the dates here. Once again, I'm going to use illness as my excuse. So, I graduated high school in the spring of 1993. And as I mentioned in Volume 1, I couldn't afford to launch over to Austin just yet. So, I worked at McDonald's and also at a furniture store, moving furniture, wrapping up orders, and setting up little room models and dioramas based on the decorator's specifications. I also worked at a place called Service Merchandise, where we would come in at night and work overnight to restock the shelves very carefully based on documents that we received from sales staff. So I did some strange stuff, but the upside is that the mid-90s were economically a very positive time. I was able to save up the money that I needed, and I got enrolled, and I moved to Austin, and I started UT in earnest in the fall of 1994. Now, since the scholarship paid for the first 2 years, that covered everything through the spring of 1996. Now, for the fall of 96, spring of 97 year, I got a grant and a loan, but I knew I would need more money to cover food and whatnot, especially if I was ever going to move out of the dorm, which I was becoming more and more desperate to do. Even though I was on my third roommate, who happened to be my favorite roommate, the bodybuilder, still, I really wanted to find an apartment with my girlfriend somewhere. We had been together for 4 years by then, and she had followed me to Austin from Winnie, so I had a feeling that our relationship was going to be stable. So that sort of sets the scene and establishes the stakes, as they say in screenwriting classes. When I applied to the Church of Scientology and then to Zimco in 1997, time was running out. Money was running out. More specifically, I was running out of money as time was running out, and I needed something fairly lucrative that I could do at the same time as take my classes. It had to be something during the evening or, of course, overnight. I was looking at night work. Whatever it was going to be, it would have to be very flexible. And so when I saw the ad for Zimco, I was impressed because it was the bottom level of private security. It would require just the unarmed license. And so I figured I could swing that. And it was paying, if I recall, $10 an hour. Now, when I was preparing for this episode, I broke out my handy inflation calculator to check, and it looks like the dollar in 1997 had exactly double the value of a dollar today in 2026. So the ground floor at Zimco was the equivalent of $20 an hour now. That's pretty good. I think that's higher than what you could get at Chick-fil-A today, or even doing DoorDash in a good area. All that, and you didn't need experience. You just needed a clean criminal background, a high school diploma. A lot of the other security companies on the higher end that guarded more dangerous properties like construction sites or retail stores, they required a higher level of licensing, and they tended to prefer ex-military guys or even recently retired policemen. But $20 an hour for something I could do at night, especially between midnight and 6 a.m., and I knew that from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., things were pretty quiet. After last call and after all the drunks went home and passed out in their bunks, I could get some reading done. And the hours were almost unlimited. I was only limited by the amount of sleep I could do without. My income would be in proportion to my caffeine intake. It was perfect. So, as I mentioned earlier, the best way to think about this is as a fantasy epic where I'm sort of stepping out on a hero's journey, much like Odysseus or Beowulf or Frodo Baggins. And just like those great heroes of old, my journey begins when my girlfriend drives me to my job interview because I don't have a car. They always cut that part out of the movie versions of the great hero stories. We never saw Bilbo Baggins' girlfriend loan him Bill the Pony to ride on his journey. And so I was a little early to the interview with Zimco. If you're driving with my wife, then girlfriend, you would know that there was zero chance that we were going to be late. Katie was going to make sure of that. She was tired of buying me my Subway sandwiches every time we went to dinner. And when I first got to the Zimco office, I saw for the first time how small-scale Zimco was. It was a pretty bare-bones operation. I liked it that way, though. It was a lot like Alexander the Great's army. As they say, lots of teeth, very little tail. The only way you knew you were on a Zimco property was the Zimco box. And we'll talk about what the Zimco box was. One way to think of it now is as a special device of conquest. Our vision was that every property would have a Zimco box on it. So I get to the office, and it's a lot smaller than I would have anticipated. The office space was very neat, very organized. I came to find out later that the office space was really rented to store uniforms and some other equipment, to store needed records, but mainly it was a way to have a physical address and a location for doing interviews. And with Zimco's turnover, you had to do interviews all the time. It had to be a constant pipeline of new guys. So I got to meet Ron. Ron's a big guy. He's taller than me, about 6'1" or 6'2". Not heavy set, but a little bulkier than average. He's a pretty big silhouette when he's wearing a jacket. He's about 12 years older than me, so I was 21 at the time, so that would make him about 33. He had recently become engaged, and as far as I know, to this day he and his lovely wife are still married. He left Zimco far behind him. As I mentioned earlier, Zimco ceased operations in 2000. Now, Ron may be practicing law somewhere, but he would be about 62 by now. Knowing Ron, I think he probably has, by this point, gathered up a Scrooge McDuck-level nest egg and is enjoying an early retirement. Ron was a problem solver. He had that quality that Matt Damon's character had in The Martian. He was calm and methodical and unemotional and logical, and he used dark or inappropriate humor to disarm people or help communicate ideas. He was good at developing policies and communicating what we're trying to do. What's the basic goal? He was a very clear thinker. Forceful. And he didn't like small talk or avoiding conflict to get along. He was the kind of guy who always said the quiet part out loud. He always dressed formally. He understood the importance of image and reputation, especially in the private security business. Even when he dressed casual, it tended to go in a golf route, meaning golf shirts and khakis, that kind of thing. He always drove a gigantic SUV, the biggest, blackest SUV he could find. He liked to cultivate that busy entrepreneur vibe. And he had a big resonant voice. If I recall, his real voice was a little more nasal than the AI can render. But Ron and I hit it off immediately. I had the impression that there would be a flood of guys in the office trying to get extra money. But when I started talking to Ron, I got the impression that he was desperate for people. I think maybe it didn't hurt that I looked like someone from a movie or a TV show. And who is that someone? Well, here are some of the character names that you might see in a script for a movie or TV show that I would pop up in. In other words, here are some of the characters I look like. Imagine that you're watching a movie or a TV show and you're following along in the script. And you see me and you're like, hey, there's Vincent. There's young 21-year-old Vincent in a leather jacket. What are they calling him in the script? Well, it would be something like one of the following. Ethnic henchman. Young tough number 3. Stern Latino boy. Young hitman. Tonto's evil twin. Sitting Bull's nephew. Geronimo. Drug dealer number 2. Mexican robber. So I found out later that Ron was having a little bit of trouble finding guys who were intimidating enough to satisfy the house mothers. It turns out the house mothers were the ones who wanted bone crusher looking dudes at the front door. Well, Ron's talent pool was a bunch of very young students, so he was having a little trouble making those ends meet. And in general, I found out later that finding young people who could pass the license test, pass the background check, get their fingerprints done, then come back with their license, get their assignments, show up on time, wear the uniform properly, do the patrols, stay awake, earn the trust of the property owners. That was almost impossible. It was very difficult to find people who could do all of those things. But Ron was trying, and even though I could tell he was maybe a little bit fatigued and busy, he had a direct informality that I liked right away. He got to the point and then moved on. He also had a definite philosophy for how Zimco was supposed to work. And it was at the job interview when I first heard that most of Zimco's properties were actually sororities.
We have 11 properties under contract. 8 are sororities. 1 is a condo, 1's a Catholic church, and 1 is a dorm. Those are sororities, but don't get any bright ideas. We aren't here for romance.
Oh, of course, I understand.
We are here to observe and report.
Understood, definitely. And which dorm does Zimco guard? I live in Jester, right now.
Well, the dorm is called Hardin House. A lot of guys call it Hard-On House, but I would never say that.
Oh, of course, of course.
We aren't here for romance. I started this company in a 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot plywood box. And that box was locked inside a janitor's closet. And that box was Zimco. What was inside that box? Well, a logbook, pins, some paper, keys, and your trusty BBF, big black flashlight. Every Zimco guard gets to swing one of these babies around. Legally, it's a flashlight. In terms of physics and biomechanics, it can crush someone's skull no problem. No problem. But we don't want bone crushers. We solve problems. with our brains.
Ah, yes. The BBF. The Big Black Flashlight. It's the weapon of choice of security guards all around the world. Because it's technically not a weapon, as Ron pointed out. Also, it really does come in handy at night when you're in a back alley, and just having the power to shine it in someone's eyes when you're outside at night can give you a huge advantage and keep the other person on their toes and not understanding exactly what you look like or what you're carrying because you've got a big light in their face. And a lot of guys, including me eventually, sometimes carried pepper spray, even though that was usually in an illegal gray area or just flat out against the rules. Ron was very careful to steer everyone away from violence.
We're in show business. Your most effective weapon is an iron. Iron your uniform. Look the part. And always wear the tie. I know it's tempting not to, but it's a big part of our image. Always wear the tie.
Oh, that's cool. I like ties. I don't have a black one, but I can get one today, no problem.
No, it's got to be a clip-on tie. Got to be clip-on.
Well, I'm pretty good at tying the knot, and I can...
For safety reasons.
Okay, I get it.
I'm as big of a fan of a nice silk tie as the next gentleman, but silk, as you may know, Vince, pound for pound is stronger than steel. And so do you really want a steel cable wrapped around your neck, ready to go for the next intoxicated person who decides he wants to make you go to sleep forever? Yeah, I don't think so. So wear that clip-on tie.
Not a problem. So this whole concept about not wearing real ties and sticking to clip-ons to prevent strangulation, that whole idea was probably a red flag. That was probably a clue about what kind of world I was getting myself into. But as you'll see, as we go on through the story, this was not a physical war that I was getting drafted into. It was a mental war, a spiritual war. It was about discipline, staying awake, keeping a sharp uniform. My shoes were cheap, but never shabby. They never lasted long, but that was the nature of the game when you're doing your patrols when you're supposed to. And of course, there was another discipline I would have to engage in, and that was staying out of entanglements with any of the residents of these properties. And not just for professional reasons, but for personal ones. As I said, I was getting this job so I could get out of the dorm and move in with my long-term girlfriend. Ultimately, I never had to use my BBF, my big black flashlight. But unfortunately, there was a guard on a property on 6th Street who did work a shift for me in 2003, the very last year that I did any security work. I felt bad when I heard the details because I immediately knew that this wouldn't have happened to me. Basically, he was on a post where there are two guards. One watches the cameras while the other one is mobile and completes a prescribed list of patrols. And the guy who's on the cameras sees someone drive over the sidewalk to get from the street into this particular parking lot, which has a swinging arm to block it off, and it is clearly marked as a private lot. But this particular person just drives over the sidewalk into the parking lot, parks their car there, and starts to get out. Well, this person who replaced me wanted to be, I guess, a good Samaritan, and they went out there to not really to confront the guy about driving over the sidewalk, but just to let him know that, hey, you can't park here, and we're going to be calling a tow truck. So I'll open the gate for you if you want to drive your car out of here. Well, the person was annoyed for some illogical reason. Maybe because he was losing face in front of the two ladies that he had driven up with. And so he tells the guard, hey, I'm not moving my car, F you, bye-bye, and he starts heading off to get his drink on with his two girlfriends. Well, my guard colleague didn't say another word. He just pulled out his little trusty notepad and wrote down the license plate and the description of the car so he could tell the tow truck driver which car to take. When the guy saw this, he became enraged and charged at the guard. The guard was able to drop his notepad and whip out his BBF. And right before the guy jumped on him, the guard got one shot in and hit the guy with his big black flashlight in his forehead and opened up a gash, and they wrestled on the ground, and the other guard called APD, and they showed up. And when the fight was over, the guy who drove over the sidewalk ended up in the back of a police cruiser with blood all over his face, unable to see, and my colleague, unfortunately, had to go home. He had a sprained ankle, and he had to pay for a doctor visit to get that looked at. And of course, there was no health insurance, no coverage for him. He paid for that out of pocket. And not only that, he had to pay $50 to buy a new uniform shirt because his old uniform shirt had the other guy's blood all over it. Now, bear in mind, this was not Zimco. This was the other company that I was working for by this point. This company had a much less personal touch than Zimco did. And so this guard got injured, he lost wages, had to pay for a doctor visit out of pocket, and then on top of that, had to buy a new uniform shirt. Welcome to the world of private security. It's not exactly fair. And on top of it all, I know that this guard was, in the end, still being a gentleman, still being kind, because he clearly just tapped the guy with the flashlight. It was not a full-on hit. So the reason this wouldn't have happened to me is because if I had watched on the cameras while this guy drove over the sidewalk, I would have concluded that this guy knew that he wasn't supposed to be in that parking lot, and there was no reason to confront him to tell him said fact, and so I would have watched him walk away with his two girlfriends to get his drink on, and then I would have just zoomed in the camera on his license plate. Then I would have picked up the big clunky landline phone in the building, and I would have called the tow truck company to come get this guy, and I wouldn't have even left the building. Now, when I saw on the cameras that he had come back on site to look for his car, and when I saw him being confused that it wasn't there, then I might go out and let him know what we had done. And of course, I might get attacked then, but he'd be a lot more drunk, probably easier to handle. But I have digressed quite severely. I'm talking about things that happened in 2003, when I should be back in 1997. So, going back to the job interview, the next step was I had to take a test. There's a licensing test that Ron has to administer, and it was interesting. So, how hard was this test? If I recall, at the time, it was about 20 multiple choice questions, and the questions had really two purposes. One was to gauge your legal understanding of the issues involved with private security. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but they have to do with who owns the property and what the contract actually does legally. But at least half of these questions were really just testing basic common sense. And the best way to explain what I mean is to give you some example questions. Now, I didn't get online to go look at the current test to give you an idea of what the questions are like. What I did was I just kind of made up 2 questions that I think feel like the questions that were on the test. So no doubt my brain has exaggerated the strangeness of the scenario just a bit, but I think just a little. So let's dig into question 1. What kind of questions were they asking me? You are guarding a construction site. During the night, you see 2 young men trespassing on the site. They are struggling to carry away a spool of copper wire. You deduce that they're trying to steal the copper from the job site. What do you do? So, like any unnecessarily confusing multiple choice test, there are like 6 possibilities. Let's take a look at them. What are our possible answers to this scenario? We have answer A, nothing. It's not my job. B, confront the men about the theft and demand that they put down the wire and leave the site. C, get a good description of the men and call the police. D, hunt them down and slaughter them like the animals they are. E, demand that the thieves give you 1/3 of their profits after selling the copper. F, all of the above. Now, I don't even know how option F is logically possible. I don't see how you could do A through E all at the same time. But that's just the kind of thing they throw at you. It's a common sense test. Now let's look at question 2. Question 2. You are guarding a convenience store. During your shift, you see a 10-year-old girl put a Snickers bar in the pocket of her hoodie before leaving the store without paying for the Snickers bar. You follow her out of the store. What do you do next? A, nothing. It's not my job. B, confront the girl about the theft and demand that she return the Snickers bar. C, pay for the Snickers bar yourself and let the girl go with a warning. She's just 10 years old after all. D, hunt her down and slaughter her like the animal she is. E, get a good description of the girl and call the police. Don't risk confronting a 10-year-old girl. F, none of the above. Once again, I don't know how you would do F because wouldn't that also be A? But not? Anyway, you can't overthink these questions. And of course, overthinking is my middle name. So I had some trouble. But in case you were wondering, the right answer for both questions was option B. You do confront the person if they are still on the property. You prevent crimes from occurring on the property as much as you can through authoritative presence. But you don't have any kind of arrest power. You can't put your hands on anybody. Unless they put their hands on you first, then of course you can defend yourself. But the big rule in terms of the law is that, at least back in my day, the contract with the property owner gives the guard some of the authority of the owner. And in Texas, people have relatively extreme authority over their own private property. So, for example, this allows properties like Hardin House to be essentially a prison for young women, with cameras and airlocks and literal fence line patrols like in a cartoon. We had to have room checks when it was suspected that a guy was in the house. And the girls would have to come out of their rooms and line up in the hallway, and house mothers would check the rooms for men, while us guards would wait outside in the hallway to step in case a guy was found, or if a fight started. More about Hardin House later. But basically, the rule was, the minute you were 1 millimeter off the property, you were just an ordinary Joe. You had no powers whatsoever. No matter how much like a cop you had dressed that day, no matter how fancy your uniform, when you're off the property that you're contracted with, you're just a dude. You can just call the police. That's it. So, I left Ron's office with a good feeling. I think I did well on the test. Ron seemed to like me. The next step was I had to go get my fingerprints taken. Ron would submit all the paperwork for me. And basically, I was just going to have to wait a couple of weeks to get my license. And at that point, I'd have to come back and fill out some more paperwork, swear to a bunch of stuff, and Ron would have completed my background check by that point on his own, and I would be on the team. But unexpected difficulties arose almost immediately, because on the way back home from the office, when Katie was driving me back to campus in her gray Jeep Cherokee, some dude, some typical Austin driver, runs a red light, plows right into us, and totals the car. It was the end of an era. Katie and I had a lot of memories of that gray Jeep Cherokee from when we started dating. Now, I tried not to think of it as a bad omen. Neither of us got hurt, after all. You know, you want to look on the bright side. But I couldn't help later on when I watched The Sopranos and I watched Christopher Moltisanti's making ceremony. I couldn't help but think of myself when Chris looked and he saw a crow on the windowsill. And he, like the audience, was thinking, wow, well, he was being inducted into the crime family, or as a great man once referred to them, a glorified crew. But Chris had a feeling that that crow on the windowsill during the ceremony had to mean that there were some dark days ahead, that maybe this wasn't going to be everything he thought it was going to be. Well, it wasn't a bad thing. It was just a weird thing. It's not that I didn't know how bad things were going to get. They didn't get bad. I didn't know how weird things were going to get. I mean, after the job interview with the Scientologists, I thought I was back in normal world. I thought it was going to be smooth sailing after that. No problems. But, as with many, many things, 21-year-old Vincent was very, very wrong. So I wish you guys had been there on the day that I checked my mail at Jester, and I looked, and my unarmed private security license had come in. And I just jumped up and down and screamed, woohoo! And everybody looked at me like I was crazy. It was just like a moment out of a 1990s rom-com. Just kidding. I just immediately called Ron and set up my first day for orientation and training. I had to go to the office again and select my uniform shirt from the long single rack of khaki cop shirts that he kept. I got my little toy Zimco badge to put on the shirt, and a black clip-on tie. Now the rest was up to me. The guard had to supply their own black leather belt, black shoes, and black or navy slacks. I went to a military surplus store that had a lot of cop-type stuff, and I got some utility belt items. Of course, anything to look just a little tiny bit more like Batman. And, of course, it had a big loop for my mag light, for my BBF. Now, Ron had a system for how Zimco guards would clock in and clock out.
When you get on a property, the first thing you do is log in. That's the first thing you do when you get on site. You gotta log in. You gotta let us know you're there. That's how you get paid. If you forget to log in, you're not there. And that equals me not being happy. And for you, that means no money. And thus, you will not be happy. You get a goose egg with a big $sign next to it, aka Jack Squat.
And we did everything by phone. The supervisor on duty had the task of either listening to the machine live as people logged in or checking the messages periodically to ensure that people were where they were supposed to be. And remember that this was all done with landlines, so the machine would record what phone number you were calling from. So it was very difficult to fake a login, especially when you have suspicious residents or house mothers who can't wait to call Zimco when the guard is not there on time. So, of course, you did have guards who tried to get fast and loose with the rules on logging in, but Ron had it worked out. It worked pretty well in the days before cell phones. And so that's the routine. You showed up, showed your face, on time, and you got on the phone, and you called Zimco to log in. Once you logged in, the next step is to set up your post. Now, with executive security and with other private security companies that I worked for later, you had this overlap of shifts. The guard shifts would overlap so that you would have a chance to pass down information and talk to the guard who was on shift before you. But Zimco was a little different. At these properties, there were only guards for the late hours. There was no guard during the day, so when you showed up at, say, 8 p.m., there was no guard there to overlap with or to get hand-downs from. So after you logged in, you go to the box. And that's where you have all your logs and your BBF and everything else.
Everything you need is in the box. But you gotta remember the combination. Don't write it down. If you can't remember 3 two-digit numbers, then I got nothing for you to do here.
Ron was kind of a blunt guy, and he definitely did not have much patience for slow learners. And so inside that box was your logbook, a flashlight, spare batteries, and some pins, and any keys that the guard would need. Once a Zimco box was on your property, that's when you knew you were in the hands of some seasoned professionals. So after this day of training and orientation and seeing myself in the mirror in my new uniform, I was thinking to myself, this is just basic rent-a-cop stuff. All I gotta do is show up on time, sit where I'm supposed to sit, do my patrols where I'm supposed to. It should be easy stuff. Boring stuff. Stuff you wouldn't make a podcast about. I would just do my rounds when I'm supposed to, write down what I see in the logbook, keep people from urinating behind the bushes or breaking into people's cars. That's about it. That's what I thought. And that's literally all there was to it. Well, actually, no. That's literally all there should have been to it. But human nature is a strange thing. And before you realize it, you're getting drunk at your boss's apartment. Or having tea with an elderly house mother at 3 a.m. Or having other kinds of 3 a.m. conversations with people. Like when it's 40 degrees and you're doing your patrols and you find some young man handcuffed to an ironwork fence, exposed to the elements, wearing just their tighty-whities. Rush season was always a little crazy. Or things could eventually escalate. These are just things that you don't expect to have to deal with. For example, I never thought I would have to help Austin police hunt down one of my coworkers. But life took that turn for me. And we'll talk about that in later episodes. It turns out that I was pretty good at this security business. And it had to do with the weird way I interact with people. I could be very nice and gracious when needed, especially when people know me. Once someone gets to know me, they find out, oh, he's just a big nerd. But if you don't know me, then of course you see me standing in the shadows and you're thinking, who is that stern Latino boy? Is that Sitting Bull's nephew? Is he a Mexican robber? Oh wait, no, he's got a rent-a-cop uniform on. One thing I should add here early on is that Ron was not a very politically correct or woke kind of guy. Woke didn't really exist in the 90s. This was Central Texas in the 1990s, of course. But it's still probably today would stand out to people that Zimco was 99% male. We had one female guard, briefly. And here's the thing. This reluctance to hire or schedule female guards didn't come from Ron. It came from the house mothers. The house mothers would complain if we sent a guard who looked like they couldn't do much. Basically, the house mothers would flat out say, if it looks like some of the girls in the building could beat up the guard, how is that guard going to make the girls feel safe? And if they don't feel safe, what are we paying for? So the female guard that we had worked at the condo, at the condominiums building. She was, if I recall, something like 5'4", 110 pounds. The condo building worked well for her. I worked that property a lot later on. You're basically a glorified doorman. But in later episodes, we'll get to know the Zimco guards and how each one of them seems to have had superpowers. Once again, a lot like Batman Begins. You can think of Ron as sort of the Liam Neeson character. He was my Raz Al Ghul, who taught me that theatricality and deception can be powerful allies. I found out that guarding young people in this kind of situation has nothing to do with what you see in the movies. In other words, I did not spend my time keeping serial killers out of people's bedrooms or keeping weirdos from sneaking into the backyard. The main thing that I guarded was guarding the kitchen from the residents. The houses usually spent a lot of money on their kitchens and the kitchen staff. Some of them had chefs. And so there was some really good food in those places. And most of them would lock their kitchen up around 11 p.m. And the guard would have the keys to all the food. And so I thought, as a security guard, I would have to be fighting at the front door to keep drunk men from trying to break into the house and harass the girls. But what actually happened was, I'm sitting downstairs at midnight being harassed myself by the residents who all, for whatever reason, have glassy, bloodshot eyes and they're just ravenously hungry. And they want me to unlock the kitchen. And I have to remind them that the house mothers make it clear, no more food out of the kitchen after 11 p.m. After a while, I started to figure out the pattern. If it's around midnight and you see just one girl come down by herself down the stairs, she's going to try to sweet talk you. She's going to try to talk about how awesome you are and how you make the girls feel safe, and boy, is she hungry, and she forgot this, or she still needs to study and needs some cereal. Something to that effect. And boy, do they get angry when you say no. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is when more than one girl comes downstairs. If a whole group of glassy-eyed girls come downstairs at once, like a zombie movie, in their pajamas, they're not going to try to sweet-talk you. They're going to bully you. You're going to be surrounded by angry, hungry girls, hangry girls, and you just got to man up and stand your ground, you know? Then it's even worse when some of the girls go to a rave or some other similar dance event and they come back at 3 a.m. with very red faces, sweating, and they all want to hug you. And they all want to show you how much you mean to them for keeping them safe. And despite having to suffer such horror and indignity, I soldiered on. I thought about my grandfather, who survived the beaches of Normandy in 1944, and he endured that when he was 21. And so here I am, enduring similar horrors. Well, they're not similar, but they're just as bad, I would say, just as hard for me. You know, Germany really didn't want to give up on those beaches and fought hard to keep the Allies out of Europe. I found out that sorority girls will fight even harder for that midnight snack. Just knowing all that gourmet free food is just sitting on the other side of that door. And the only thing standing between you and that glorious meal is Tonto's evil twin, this ethnic henchman. So, my grandfather and I had to endure very similar tests of courage and character. And I'm here to say, I passed with flying colors. I made it. I'm a real man. Well, that's it for this week. I don't want to promise the rap song again, only to disappoint. But I'm going to do that. I promise. I'll have it next week. I'm definitely working on recording it. I have definitely practiced the lyrics, saying them to myself out loud over and over so that I've developed some muscle memory. So, we'll see whether all this trouble is worth it. Or will we? That's the suspense I like to create. Will Vincent do what he said he would do? Or will he cave in and flake and get sick again? You just never know with me. So, other than launching my hip-hop career, what else are we doing next week? Well, we're going to talk a lot more about Harden House.
A lot of guys call it hard-on house.
I know, Ron. I remember, yep.
But I would never say that.
They remember. Also known as a prison for young girls. And I was the warden. And if you want to know what it's like to be in prison and have Vincent as your warden, luckily for you, they already made that movie. It's called The Shawshank Redemption. So if you want to know what I was like when I worked at Harden House, just think of the warden in The Shawshank Redemption. The guy that had Andy do his taxes for him and got mad when he called him obtuse. And, let's be honest, I do share some characteristics with this guy. We're both control freaks, like to dress kind of formally, force people to read the Bible. It's all making sense now. And so, just like Andy Dufresne, these poor girls, trapped in Harden House with me, were using their little rock hammers to dig tunnels through the walls behind their Justin Timberlake posters to get away from me. But no luck. Sorry. Vincent is going to enforce the rules. And because I enforced the rules, Ron liked my work, and next week we'll talk about my promotion. I was promoted to the coveted supervisor position, which means that I had to deal with problems with other guards. I had to learn all the properties, and I began to spend a lot more time with Ron. I was at his apartment regularly. I started doing the schedule for Zimco. We'll also talk a lot more about house mothers and how winning over the house mother is the real key to success in the sorority security guard game. We will talk about some stories from the Tri-Delt house. We guarded Delta, 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 and they can't help you. They're busy getting up to no good. We'll also talk about some of the crazy guards that I got to meet, and some of my first forays into the frustrations of management. It turns out that managing people at a job is slightly more difficult than controlling people in a cult. It turns out that you have a lot more power over people in a cult, and so it's easier for the leader. But anyway, eventually I was doing interviews for Zimco at that little office, and we will eventually get back to how it all ended and what Scientology has to do with all of this. And so, until then, talk to you later.